Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome to the Stoa for the final session of Body and Soul, the Mind of Culture, our fifth and final event. We are ecstatic that we have an all-star session for sure here tonight for this final session. I want to first welcome my co-conspirator in this endeavor, Gregg Henriques, Double G. How you doing, Double G?
Hey, man, I am great. I am psyched. The arc of this thing has really been excellent. Thank you so much for your leadership and putting it together. But
Absolutely, man. And we're going to welcome our guests right now. We have to start with the general, the very first guest at the Stoa when it began, Jordan Hall. Welcome, Jordan. And followed by Zachary Stein, Zach Stein, who has done a series here. And of course, Jordan has also. So most of the folks here know them, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that Jamie Wheal has come onto the Stoa. Welcome, Jamie. Okay, so let me give you a little overview of how we're going to approach the very beginning part of what we're going to do. We're going to give when I say we, I'm talking about Gregg, Double G, and I, an overview of the series. Then we're going to do an exercise, a short exercise where we're going to ask you all to reflect on your own sense, from a sensory perspective, of the title, an emergent, giving birth to an emergent wisdom commons. And we're going to listen to some beautiful music by Bill Evans as we do that. Then we're going to take off mute the video and audio for everyone except for the guests and the hosts, engage in conversation, then we'll bring you all back in, okay? So I'd like to hand it over to Gregg Henriques, who will start with an overview of sessions 1 and 2.
Amen. So for me, as I was just starting to allude to, the arc of this thing has been both inspiring and beautiful, and it's an excellent opportunity to end with Emergent Commons. So we started with a 4-part jam session on matter, life, mind, and culture. Some of Gregg's friends, esteemed professors of physics and evolutionary biology, paired up with me and Gregg, where I took mind and Gregg took culture and the physicist took matter, and Brandon took life, the evolutionary biologist. And that really set the stage in a TOK sort of way for what this is unfolding. And then we popped on over and joined with Johnny V, Stealing the Culture, Johnny V, and Steve McIntosh, who engaged in a really fascinating discussion about values and what was transcendent, what might be sacred, how do we think about the evolution of values. And so what you have there is a juxtaposition of domains of fact, then interspersed with value to create a particular stage. And then the last 2 sessions we had. Gregg, you want to?
Absolutely. Last Monday, we had a double header. We started with an ecology of communications featuring Nora Bateson and Diane Mushaw Hamilton. Fascinating discussion on the various ways that communication can get blocked, can open up, and primarily how you can create a container, an ecological container and frame for communication, interpersonal and group. Whereas Nora, she creates these warm data labs that, as she says, starts off kind of wild, but manifests into a kind of a majestic complexity where people are more open to actually engaging on difficult topics once they've set a frame that's aside from those difficult topics. And Diane Musho Hamilton's talking about her facilitating and dealing with sameness and difference. And there was comparison and contrast and wonderful, delicious tension in those two approaches. And then in the afternoon, we had Zach Stein and Daniel Smachtenberger dealing with where do we go from here, the we, the I, and the it, taking a look at first person, second person, and third person dynamics, and how we can increase our sovereignty, how we can not be beholden to all of the crap that's out here and targeted at us so we can increase our sovereignty. And the primary way of doing that was this consilience project. That was the primary theme that was discussed. So that's what we did to lead up to here. Yeah.
Amen.
So what I'd like everyone to do now, our theme tonight is giving birth to an emergent wisdom commons. I'd like everyone to reflect as we listen to Bill Evans and his trio play about 2 minutes of My Foolish Heart. What would an emergent wisdom commons look like, feel like, sound like, taste like to you? Okay. We did that so that you can exercise your own sovereignty in using your imagination and your imaginal to feel into what we're going to be talking about. So as we talk about it, you can see how it fits or doesn't, or how you can even expand what you came up with through what Jordan, Jamie, Zach, and Gregg share. All right, so we'd like everyone now to please put your audio and video on mute so that on the screen we will just see the hosts and the guests. We appreciate that. Okay, and the video also. Okay. All right, so I guess that's the way that works. Okay. Okay, so I think it only right that we start with the gentleman who this is his first time here at the store, Mr. Jamie Wheal. We'd like you to unmute yourself and tell us what arises for you when you hear the theme, our title, Giving Birth to an Emergent Wisdom Commons. What does that mean to you?
Well, actually, I'll tell you what. Let me ask a procedural question.
Sure.
Because I think we have I think you had lined it up for about 3 minutes each for us. Is that right?
2 to 3.
Kind of opening statements kind of thing.
Yes.
And then freestyle jam in the middle. The short answer is there's a section in the book that I've just finished writing that is specifically about this, and it's through the idiom of music and the American tradition.
Ooh.
So would it be okay if I just read that?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because yeah, I mean, you guys have so beautifully, there we just had that great passage, and this is kind of the thing, right? So, what to me the emergent wisdom tradition or the commons is something that we already have, and it's in the notion of the American folkways of our musical traditions. And no surprise, preaching to the choir here. But this is the section. I think honestly, it's probably my favorite section of the entire book. So it's preceded by me stumbling into a Grateful Dead show at age 18. And
can you do us a favor, Jamie? Tell everyone the title of the upcoming book.
Oh, it's called Recapture the Rapture. Rethinking God, sex, and death in a world that's lost its mind. So it's basically it's an invitation, and it's kind of it's like the blockchain of transformational consciousness and culture, so that it could be that 1,000 fires can burn around the world, right? So not that there's a singular tops down, but what is possible if we all share a schema for creating the kind of the world and the community that we're hoping for. So long story short, went to the Dead show. They dropped into Going Down the Road Feeling Bad, and it was a kick-ass tune. And I came home and I started playing it on the stereo, and my dad starts chiming into the song, and I'm like, wait a second, how the hell do you know a Grateful Dead song? And he's like, oh, that's an old Woody Guthrie tune. That's an old Pete Seeger tune. And he pulls out his banjo and he starts doing a finger-picking rendition. And the lyrics are slightly different, like folk songs often are, right? And it turns out that his banjo, he had been given to him by Pete Seeger's kid sister, Peggy, because they were in the London folk scene together. So that was kind of my down the rabbit hole into the American song tradition. And then this is the section about the arcana Americana, meaning the kind of the secret living scripture within our songways. Once I started connecting them, those dots crisscrossed America from Nova Scotia to Appalachia to California to Africa before popping back up in the strangest of places, like full moon polyethnic Cajun slamgrass tribal stomps in the mountains of Colorado and flashy headliner sets at Coachella. But no matter where those dots led, tracing the catalog of the Grateful Dead, the coffee house folk of Bob Dylan, or the blues-infused revival of the British rock invasion, they kept coming back to a mild-mannered guy named Alan Lomax. Lomax was a music geek who'd grown up in the early 1900s in Austin, Texas, and bounced between Harvard and other schools before finding his vocation. He started out by helping his father, a folklorist, gather field recordings of cowboy tunes. But Alan really came into his own when he took over leadership of the Library of Congress's archive of folk song in 1937. He lugged clunky metal and wax recording equipment along with him all across the country. Lomax made over 10,000 field recordings and captured the voices and sounds of an America that most people never knew existed. he became fascinated by the seemingly incoherent diversity of American folk song as an expression of its democratic, interracial, international character. He interviewed the famous folk singer Woody Guthrie, jazz legends Big Bill Broonzy and Jelly Roll Morton, Chicago blues icon Muddy Waters, and dozens of others. While a meaningful number of Lomax's recordings captured the folkways of the African American South, the music of this country really emerged as a mishmash of traditions and influences. From the Scots-Irish Celtic tunes of hardscrabble Appalachia that grew into bluegrass and country music, to the French Catholic fiddle strains of Acadian music that then became the Cajun zydeco of Mardi Gras. Everywhere displaced people suffered and prevailed, these redemption songs became a way of giving point and purpose to their struggle. Homo Americanus is part Yankee ingenuity, part backwoodsman, Indian, or gamecock of the wilderness, and part Negro. Albert Murray, the founder of jazz at Lincoln Center, said of the country's essential character. The blues tradition itself, he wrote in The Hero and the Blues, is the candid acknowledgement and sober acceptance of adversity as an inescapable condition of human existence, and, perhaps in consequence, an affirmative disposition toward all obstacles, whether political or metaphysical. When 1920s bluesman Ferry Lewis lamented, "I've been down so goddamn long, 'cause it seems like up to me," he was embodying Murray's affirmative disposition toward the obstacles of life, naming it, claiming it, transcending it. Apparently, his sentiment struck a chord. Everyone from Nancy Sinatra to the Doors to the hip-hop superstar Drake have covered his song. Murray protege Stanley Crouch gave a name to this balance of adversity and triumph: swing. It's that combination of grace and intensity we know as swing. In jazz, sorrow rhythmically transforms itself into joy, which is perhaps the point of the music. Joy earned or arrived at through performance, through creation. And that's the thing that we're really trying to tease apart here, that somehow, buried in this polyglot mishmash tradition of the American songbook, lies something potentially profound, a philosophy, a way of being, a secret scripture, an arcana that not only sheds light on where we've come from, but hints at a way forward for all of us. Because these redemption songs aren't just about looking on the bright side of lousy situations. They're powerful calls to radical transformation. The question's not having hope, Cornel West insisted at a lecture at Harvard Divinity School. The question is being a hope. Having hope is still too detached, too spectatorial. You got to be a participant. You got to be an agent. You keep on pushing, Curtis Mayfield says. Be a force for good, Coltrane says. Mississippi goddamn, says Nina Simone. That ain't having hope. That's being a hope. Courageously bearing witness, regardless of what the circumstances are, because you're choosing to be a kind of person of integrity to the best of your ability before the worms get your body. Boom. That's it. That's blues. Beautiful tradition.
Man, you got me over here with chill bumps over here, man. You're intoning my mentor, Albert Murray. He was my mentor.
Well, that was a hat tip to you, good sir, because I know this is where you're from.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful.
Wow. Thank you. All right. That's, boy, I wouldn't want to be in Zach or Jordan's shoes, man. Now, these cats are heavyweights, but to follow that, who wants to go next? Zach, Jordan, even Double G, Gregg, go for it. Just chime in. Or should I just call on somebody? Because then folks are you?
Zach Stein, I saw him. He moved his. I
Did
saw
I?
him teach.
All right. It was beautiful, Jamie. It was beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
This was the first thing I ever studied. Seriously, I had been a musician in high school all along. And when I got to college, I had no intention of Hampshire College, no intention of graduating. That's why you go to a place like Hampshire College, because there aren't tests or grades. And the music department was good. And I studied African-American history and folk music and Indian classical music, but mostly the jazz tradition. And, when I think of Bill Evans, I think, of course, of Kind of Blue. And when I think about that, I think about the notion of the commons having the intrinsically collaborative nature, right? Like huge heavyweights on that album, but you can't say who is the standout, really, right? Is it Cannonball Adderley? Sometimes. Is it Coltrane? Yeah, a lot of the time. Is it Miles? Well, most of the time, right? So it's like, and it's none of them, as opposed to like Henriques, right? Who was a force with much wisdom, but it was the Henriques show. Like when Henriques showed up in London and played for the first time, and you had Peter Townsend there and, Eric Clapton there, and people from the Beatles, and they were like, oh, that's how you play a guitar. Right. And there's a way in which there was no one else on stage when Henriques was playing, which was amazing, but Kind of Blue is different. Kind of Blue has a sense of wisdom to the album. Like you can feel the hesitation and the precision, especially in the slow songs, which are very hard to play because you have to be subdividing so consistently to actually land during these slow. So there's just an amazing wisdom to that album. And it is worth noting too, you don't get an album like that if the guys are in it for ulterior motives. At a certain point, the music becomes the thing. And that's where you get the proper notion of something like a commons, as opposed to a commodified space where wisdom is trafficked in, but you wouldn't say that it's an emergent kind of wisdom commons, because there are different motives for being there. So that's, I think, a way to kind of move us back into this frame of like, what is the emerging wisdom commons? What are the sources? And Jamie's pointing, I think, to indispensable sources, and that's how I got into, anyway, through jazz history, to these characters like Coltrane, specifically Sun Ra, where the American songbook went cosmic, basically. And you moved from the blues into like a cosmic blues. I think of Coltrane here in particular. And so that's literally what got me reading Philosophy of Religion and Ken Wilber. And then the rest is history, like from a biography of Coltrane to Blavatsky, and then up and out, basically. And so, yeah, so there's very much a sense that one of the hidden keys within the culture right now to a lingering resource of wisdom has got to be music. And there's a lot more to say there, but I think I'll leave it at that and hand it over to Jordan, I suppose.
So just one thing to drop in there. I think, Jamie, you got good news and you got bad news. I think the bad news is, I think you may have just crushed your book sales. The good news is, I think you just blew up your audiobook sales. There's no fucking way I'm going to read that book in my voice. That's clearly crazy. Oh, man. All right. So giving birth to an emergent wisdom commons. Well, when I feel each note, right, pluck each string and let it play out until it becomes silent. When I feel emergent, two things come up. One thing is this notion about how there is from the parts to the whole, right? The emergent as a notion is all about that. right? The bringing together of some kind of wholeness from a pre-existing apartness. And then the second piece is very much this notion of from 0 to 1, right? Coming from nothing into something, which implies, which requires an invocation of the creative source, connection to source, the ability to source from source and bring something into the real that has not yet been there. And then wisdom. Wisdom, it's not saying pretty things. It's not thinking smart thoughts. Wisdom is about developing discernment to find that path where your well-being and the well-being of that larger whole to which you are intrinsically connected are in alignment, and then choosing to walk that path. Wisdom is living this. Wisdom is to live that into life, not just to know it and not just to talk about it. In commons, here in commons, all I have to do is point out the fact that I was afforded a revelation in my session on the Stoa, on this question of the commons, where I'm going to say Evan and Forrest brought forth the recognition that the commons and the sacred are two different ways of saying the same thing. And that's a deep thought, right? When you think about the commons, and if you think about it like a big farm and a whole bunch of people farming and taking their portions out, you may not get there. But if you take that as an axiom and work backwards, so what's the felt sense? What does it mean to be intrinsically in relationship to anything by and means of the sacred, to feel the sacredness that is imbued in something? And that is the mechanism by which it can only truly be a commons. Okay, that's a different vibe. So what I notice is that all three of these notes seem like they're different ways of saying the same thing. I hear my seraphim saying, holy, holy, holy. It's the path of wholesomeness. It's the path whereby each individual seeks within themselves the tune of attunement to the sacred, that ability to sense the creative source and direct them upwards and upwards along the path of higher and higher values, whereby the realization of that resources them and resources the world so they are better able to do so in further. Yeah. Giving birth. And just think about it. It's the simplest thing, right? It starts with a single cell. It starts with a cell that begins to divide, and it begins to find its wholeness, right? The parts maintaining their integrity. They have to maintain their integrity, and yet they're coming from the outside in and growing and seeking and becoming and recapitulating the whole of evolution in a single 9-month period, at least among the giving birth to a human wholeness. There needs to be a womb. There needs to be a mother. Feels very feminine, this set of words you guys put out there. But to me, it feels like the path of wholesomeness. It feels like the path of allowing, and the path where there's something about each individual seeking in themselves the unique path that is theirs, and in walking that path, finding for others a way, showing up in a way that allows others to more fully find their own path. And then you start getting that harmony, that resonance, that frequency that begins to feel like an emergent wholeness, begins to look out at us, and we can hear it, we can tune into it, and then we're doing jazz together.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful. Gregg Henriques, you have some things to share regarding wisdom and its connection to the stack of energy matter to life, to mind, to culture, and metaculture. But take it where you will.
Yeah.
What do you have to say, sir?
Well, the first thing that I'll say is that I'm feeling a bit humbled. And I'll confess that I kind of have a tone deaf inability to hear music sometimes. All my high school friends were into music. And so I would hang out with a musical band. And it was a really interesting experience to have people in the culture and be so much more fluid than I was. And I throw that out there because I think one of the things about the Wisdom Commons is we have to figure out a way to resonate across so much scale and so much place. You know, there's some things I'm quite fluid in, you know, like psychological theory. I can do that in my sleep. You know, that just comes like boom. And then there are other things like, man, I don't know how to do that. And I ain't never going to know. Right. So one of the things for us is to figure out how much relational space that allows for the mutual relational value of our potentials and our limitations. And that is coming up for me right now because you guys just knocked the musical notes out of the park. And I was feeling a little bit, in relationship to that. But I will say, in terms of what I feel like when I saw sort of the framing of this final episode in relationship to the crescendo of what we were doing, what for me, you know, I think in terms of this tree of knowledge thing, you know, and basically this crescendo of evolution and of energy and matter and life and mind and culture. And then fundamentally this loop, this post-metamodern loop, where all of a sudden our propositional knowledge gets aligned with our perspectival knowledge in harmonious relation that drops us into primate ways of being and gives us a musical tone that allows us to feel that felt sense of being that then echoes into the commons and does so in a way that is good all the way down.
Okay. So each of you, you mentioned theory of knowledge, you mentioned, you know, TOK, Gregg, and each of you have projects that you are engaged in working on that contribute to this wisdom commons and the emergent birth of that wisdom commons. Jordan, the Civium, Zach, Consilience Project. Jamie, you've got in the last part of the book that you mentioned, ethical cult building. So each of you have these frames that contribute to this. I'm wondering if you could comment on that so that we can bring those projects into being and present here now. And any of you can go. It doesn't have to be a particular order. We are in the free flow part of our discussion. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because the Consilience Project is in some ways relevant, but I'm also the co-president of the Center for Integral Wisdom with Ken Wilber and Gaffney and Howard Bloom and Daniel Schmachtenberger. And
presence that, man.
And we actually just did the board meeting and they were all there. It was amazing to have Ken and Howard Bloom on the line at the same time. And you know, what's interesting is that the marketplace for wisdom makes it difficult to produce wisdom sometimes. Mm-hmm. So like the work done at the Center for Integral Wisdom, I think is essential. It's extremely important. But the difficulty of finding niches in which work of that class and type can take place in a non-instrumentalizable way, and where it isn't confused with the other easily commodifiable. So this is one of the things I want to surface is Center for Integral Wisdom, and there's work unfolding there, which is basically bringing forward Ken's vision under this banner of cosmoerotic humanism, specifically looking at the role of first principles and first values, evolving first principles and first values. And so there's much to get into there. And the Consilience Project, is trying to teach people how to reflect on the nature of what they're engaging and trying to, you know, some of the most basic things I keep turning back to every day when I'm working on this stuff is the wisdom of time and sequencing, that everything has a season and that we have sped up and have been sped up and forced to speed up, basically. And so if I was going to say, where is the Consilience Project coming in? There's a ton of stuff we're doing that's cognitive. I wouldn't say it's about wisdom, right? It's about sense making very clearly. But there's another dimension here that is about self-awareness in regards to your engagement with media and things of that nature, which toys with wisdom. But Center for Integral Wisdom, I mean, that's the wheelhouse of it. So I can bring that language to bear here, and would be happy to. So yeah, so I'll just touch those two in there to get it going.
Thank you. All right. Jordan, Jamie?
Almost. Okay, so in a broader sense, Zach mentions the market for wisdom gets in the way of wisdom. And here what I mean in a broader sense is there's the notion of enclosure. Spiritual enclosure, intellectual, mental enclosure, the profaning of the sacred, right? The enclosure of the commons. I think about that history of music, and I think about the degree to which there's a whole story of the grasping for one brief moment of authenticity and sacredness before the machine is able to ingest and digest it right back so it can chew it up and shit it out. And there's something about the difficulty of really, really gently. Now I'm okay. Now I'm feeling Nora, Warm Data Labs. Like the intrinsic absolute necessity of things like appropriate slowness. You can't have a baby born where the entire skeletal structure is built before the nervous system even begins. Everything goes step by step. Everything is sensing its whole, it's sensing its place, it's sensing its right timing, and it emerges in these very interesting discrete phases. It can only carry what it can carry. You give birth too early and it can't thrive outside the womb. Like there's something about that. There's something about containers, and there's something about pace, and there's something about connectedness, and there's something about being incomprehensibly careful, right? The carefulness that is precisely appropriate to the sacred with this thing in the context of the recognition of the reality that we live in the most profane of all possible times.
Jamie.
This is such an interesting high level conversation. I'm kind of like, well, what's the chord change? Like what is to be played next? And I honestly have no fucking idea.
Well, let me ask you, in terms of, I haven't read it, the site for your upcoming book. I know that part 3 has to do with ethical cult building. And I'll use the expression, let 1,000 flowers bloom, which I think connects with what you have in mind. So relate that to the commons, man.
Yeah, I mean, look, to sort of, I'm interested in fail points, right? I'm interested in weak links, not rosiest hypotheticals. And so if we're talking about this, it fundamentally runs aground on the human factor, just time and again. And within, like, you get on stage, you play within a lineage or a discipline. There's a certain sense of how you're supposed to play. You don't come blathering across people. There's a lot of attentive listening. That whole notion of cutting contest where someone shows up and brings more heat than somebody else was supposed to be playing, and like who's on rhythm, who has lead. Like there is a language of collaboration that is kind of sacrosanct within music, and it's true in, I think, any path of mastery. Like, outdoor adventurers, big wave surfers, big mountain climbers, the badder ass you are out there, the less you talk shit in the bar. There's all these kind of balancing mechanisms for ego, right? Trumping the groove. And, an example, which I referred to back when, there's infinite ones, in particularly in the improvisational jazz space. And you guys are the masters of that knowledge. For me, it was noticing what happened with the Grateful Dead doing something very specific, which was add industrial strength psychedelics and tens of thousands of people with amplified music. Now let's see what is co-creative emergent among this thing, where, you know, they even had a song where the lyrics say people joining hand in hand while the music played the band. They forgot about the time. And so that thing that they first discovered with Ken Kesey at the original acid test became the thing they went looking for the rest of their career. And one of the, you know, and they were prepared to subjugate pop success and everything else to it. But it was only possible for, I think, I mean, there was, you know, that yes, the amplified music, the emphasis on pristine quality of sound through psychedelically enhanced nervous systems, you know, all of that. But it was fundamentally that Jerry Garcia, the lead guitarist, even though he was channeling Gnostic, Christic liturgy, right, refused to grab the ring. He refused to become the one. So his eschewing of taking the claim constantly put it back into the intersubjective, and they were willing to suck terribly often on the off chance that one night they would pull up out of the mud, right, the jewel in the lotus. And so that capacity to get beyond ourselves and get beyond any particular glory or leadership or certainty or even tidiness, and truly go down into the mud where it can all fall apart and we can end up flat on our faces, that seems to be a prerequisite for actually coming up with the jewel. And so I'm curious, you know, like, how do we do that these days, especially if we don't feel all hippy dippy and like we've got all the time in the world, you know, when it's high stakes and time pressured, and we actually have to be figuring this thing out together under duress. And it almost, I mean, this was maybe when Zach was talking, you know, the idea or the notion came to me, which is for us to link up as fellow humans in 3D in real time, let's say co-located, you know, the old quaint notion pre-COVID, right? We're actually in the same space together. And our capacity to do that is the rate limiter to, can we create this emergent commons of wisdom, right, that is sort of greater than any one of ours, right, greater than anything we could have known ahead of time. It's truly new in that moment. And it feels like, you know, not I hesitate to bring up this notion, but it's like the Kairos Chronos thing, right? So the idea of like, we have a better chance of connecting an emergent wisdom together in Chronos, horizontal clock time, the more we get out of our own way in Kairos via linkages to our lineages and our ancestors. So, you know, but, you know, 7 generations backwards and forwards. And then if we are just a node in a lifeline of an archetypal unfolding of our family lineage, then I am potentially less likely to be a prick in 3D, right? And get in the way of the groove.
Hmm. Who wants to take the mic?
I'll offer a few thoughts. Powerful stuff. You know, for me, where I'm located in this space, you know, I'm more and more, I'm finding myself as an American psychologist who's now jettisoned out of my home. And I'll use the reference of rooted cosmopolitan, which Gregg Thomas, rooted in terms of my own particular background, upbringing, sociocultural place in the professional and nation canopy. That's where I grew up. And I learned what the modern and postmodern language's ways of being in that culture. And for me, one of the things that I'm seeing as emerging is we have to be able to get adjacent to our systems of justification as we also appreciate how they rooted us in our own socialization. And if we can stay aware of where we come from and listen to others as they intersect and appreciate those narratives and both go pre paradigm, meaning, hey, how do we relate to each other at the primate level? And trans, like, hey, how do we do above? And can we harmonize in doing that? And my particular place in relationship to this is, as somebody who comes from American psychology, I have something to say in relationship to that crazy field. And the modernist version of it basically is corrupt. Okay, it's like there's something foundationally wrong that we can identify. And there is a potential missing bridge between what the science of psychology says and the way to be as human beings in ways that are nourishing, that the therapists seek. There is a way to do that. I'm aware of that. And that's a very relevant line in relationship to how we might go from knowledge systems to the cultivation of, for me, wisdom energy, which is the embodiment of love and connection and the eudaimonic endpoint.
I'd like to do a quick shift, and that shift is to presence someone. I think it's important when you talk about commons, you need to look at some best practices. I mean, the whole tragedy of the commons problem, you have to presence that. You know, if you have a commons and you've got one jerk that decides to, you know, take more than he or she is supposed to take, and it screws up the whole thing. I mean, there's a more sophisticated way of talking about it, but that's basically it.
It's a big problem.
You've got a woman, Eleanor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize in 2009, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics for addressing this very problem. So what I like to do is presence Eleanor Ostrom by screen sharing a quick document that shows what her 8 principles for managing a commons is. Okay. She's important because she took a look at actual commons. It wasn't just theoretical for her. She looked at Swiss villages. She looked at places in Kenya, as you can see, Guatemala, Nepal, Turkey, Los Angeles. And she came up with 8 principles for how a commons can be governed sustainably and equitably in a community. Okay. First, you define clear group boundaries. 2, match rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. 3, ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. Look at how in jazz, you've got a foundation, but you can also shift things. 4, make sure the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. So, Jordan, that's game B and game A. That's inside the civium and outside the civium, right? 5, develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behavior. So you monitor each other. 6, use graduated sanctions for rule violators. You don't just cancel them. You give them, there's a graduated way of dealing with it. 7, provide accessible low-cost means for dispute resolution. And 8, build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. Okay, so I had to do that. And one of the reasons I had to do that is because, Jordan, you mentioned Evan and Forrest in that session for your series that you happen not to be there. And I've watched that twice now. And some of the participants in the chat mentioned Eleanor Ostrom, but it was never presenced. So I had to do that because if we're talking about the commons, I think we need to look at some best practices. She won a 2009 Nobel Prize. We need to give her some play. You know what I mean? So any comments on what I just shared?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I just saw Benita in the comments just, basically saying the devil's in the details, right? It's congruent enforcement of those things. And I think Jordan, I don't remember if you ever picked it up, but I know I slung it your way. There's a study of 19th century Hispanic sheep herding in the mountains of New Mexico. So back to really case study in the world, not just theory. It's called Enchantment and Exploitation. And it contrasts Hispanic sheep herding communities in those mountains, arid desert, limited resources. If you crush the commons, they don't come back, kind of thing. So really it mattered. And how there were really strong disincentives to overgraze, to double or quadruple your herd beyond what your family needed, those kind of things. And there was built-in social shaming, right? The mothers and the grandmothers, would be like, what are you doing, asshat? Like, hey, and that notion, and I know that Brett Weinstein and Daniel and Jordan had floated that notion of sort of like a rule omega, right? And that idea of give each other the benefit of the doubt, presume the signal and the noise. And we've toyed with some version of kind of code omega, which is the idea of, a little bit like what finally undid Joe McCarthy and what we might have wished we'd seen a little more of in the last 4 or 5 years in politics, which is have you no shame, sir? Right? And not Brene Brown, ooh, shame's a bad thing. No, actually, guilt, let's say guilt's a bad thing. Like I'm not worthy, I'm not just, etc. Diminishment of self and agency. But that shame, I have violated the norms of my community and am obligated to atone, feels like a massively it's an emaciated nutrient, I think, these days. And when you see, and Zach's point about wisdom being captured in the spiritual marketplace, that is largely because of Instagram yogis who have no fucking shame. Podcast ayahuasqueros, you're like, what the fuck? I cannot believe you're doing what you're doing. You're no longer self-policing. And so now we all end up in fragmented hypervigilance around each other's norm violations versus the idea of, in tennis or cricket or, or golf or take your pick, right? The expectation that we all step onto the pitch or bow onto the mat in martial arts, whatever it would be, with an expectation that I will self-police myself within the system based upon the previously agreed upon norms, ethics, and values. So in order for us to preserve the commons, and by the way, that enchantment and exploitation, the New Mexico sheep herding thing, the second half of the book is the range wars and what happens when Eastern funded capitalist ranchers farming beef come in and fence all the commons, and what the fuck happens to the ecology as that all goes down. So it's a fascinating edge case as to different communities of practice and values, different capital incentive structures, and then also different cultural rewards and disincentives. But to me, that's a piece. And Jordan, I know I came into this knowing I wanted to ask you whether or not this is the moment. Let's at least put a pin in the map for you to, if you're down, to share your notion of fiduciary responsibility, your kind of reinterpretation of that. Because to me, that's the opposite side. Like what I've just articulated is the social side, shame as governor of what are the boundaries of a commons and how do we self-police versus always have to be policed by others. And then Jordan has articulated, I haven't heard it anywhere else, the fascinating legal notion of what happens in digital commons and what are the responsibilities in the kind of too big to fail space, where there are players in the mix that have outsized influence.
Sure. And just to preface, so nobody makes an error, I feel like being a dick right now. So I am going to be a dick right now. Not to you, Jamie, just FYI, it's coming up. So because I was thinking about Ostrom's list, right? And as I was thinking about it, even just like the very particular line, Gregg called out the notion of the outside has to respect the boundaries.
Yeah,
really?
Right. Yeah.
Fucking gay mate's existing, its essence is to fuck with the boundaries. Like, there's no way. Come on. That ain't going to happen. No, let's talk about fiduciary. By the way, it was Forrest, just FYI. This was back when Force was being double plus secret, so I had to talk about it. But he's actually the guy who put it together, which is often the case. So the notion is actually, I mean, it's beautiful in the way that he does it. He said, look, here's the deal. We have this notion of relationships, and we've got this weird idea that in a market transaction, we can treat the relationship as if it's symmetric, even when we know it's not symmetric. So we apply the rules of a symmetric relationship, person A and person B, both are actually able to make the choice they want to make. Like neither one's under duress. Both know what the hell they're into, right? That kind of a basic sense. Like we assume, we impose that, we make that axiomatically the case in how transactions operate. And so like I can sign a click wrap agreement with Facebook where I give up everything and they give up nothing. And the legal interpretation is, yeah, whatever, dude, that's a transaction. You guys made an agreement. And Forrest's point is, are you out of your mind? I mean, obviously not. And we've had that for a long time. In fact, we've taken the notion of fiduciary responsibility, which at its essence is precisely the recognition when there is an asymmetry of relationship, traditional arm's length transactions can't happen at all. And we cannot allow them to happen, right? I can't allow an individual who is in relationship with the psychiatrist to sign a contract that gives the psychiatrist the right to fuck them up, right? That's the point, right? It's an asymmetric relationship, fiduciary responsibility of care. It has to happen. Now, Forrest's point is to say, look, if you look at the essence of it, we've discovered it in certain circumstances. We've noticed it in the context of like stocks, finance, where the financial services guy, lawyers, like that kind of a thing. But the reality is, it has to do with whenever you got an adequately asymmetric relationship, the only way for that to actually not become game theoretically a niche for exploitation is for a fiduciary responsibility to be imputed to the more powerful entity, like full stop. Okay. Now here's the deal. Logic is sound. History is solid. Case law and common law is actually pretty good. Possibility of happening? Zero. Why? Because we live in the most profane of all possible worlds, right? Truth's meaningless. Wisdom is meaningless. Power is not even particularly meaningful. Right? We can't even use like good old fashioned fuck you, I'm going to punch you in the face because we got nukes pointed at everybody. It's crazy land. So this emergent, like giving birth to an emergent wisdom commons, like if you really, really hold the reality of the magnitude of the challenge of trying to enable and support the sacred's emergence in the context of this world, it's a whole different kind of gig. Like you have to really think about it at the micro level, the smallest and smallest, right? Where is it really possible? Where can the seed actually begin to germinate and to sprout? And then can you hold it a little bit here and there, but not just to create like a little micro, what did Hakeem Bey call it? TAZ, temporary autonomous zone, right? You got to have a way of saying, okay, the intent here is to create a permanent autonomous zone through a series of iterative temporary autonomous zones that are intentionally linking up and building and exploring the emergent wisdom. Notice that too, the elision here. One mind is say emergent wisdom commons, emergent commons, but emergent wisdom, recognize it's been about 35,000 years of us doing a lot of the wrong stuff, maybe 70,000 years, depending on how you like to do your history. And that, by the way, is assumed that we're using the authoritative, legitimate, colonial, imperialist history to use our dating process. So if you hit delete on that, it's who knows. All right, so we're in a place of we have to actually rediscover even the notion of what wisdom might be in the real time of the maelstrom. And yeah, I know there's a clock ticking too. So it's a powerful problem. I take a look at Ostrom's list and I say, okay, what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw it in Zach's lap and say, run that, but don't think about shepherding. Think about like education. Think about child rearing. Think about parenting. Think about that as a commons. What happens in that context? What happens if you try to apply those rules? Can I do a mapping? Can I take those rules, transject them up into an abstraction layer, and then instantiate them back in the domain of education? And can I begin to see more and more? And can I get an intuitive felt sense so I can actually have like a masterful playfulness, like this notion of jazz that we're coming back in, and artfulness that actually has the ability to enter into novelty without having to import a structure that is clearly not going to be trustworthy, but nonetheless can instruct us to build the artfulness so that we can begin to play in the emergent wisdom commons.
One thing I want to add is the last part of what you said is kind of a prototypical description of how innovation actually occurs. you take something in one domain and you put it in another domain where it's not usually there, and it's reframed and it's something new. And so I love the way you said take ostrom and put it into parenting, put it into education, so that's the kind of innovation that we obviously need to be able to create an emergent wisdom commons. Now, Zach hasn't spoken for a minute, so I'd like to give him a chance, if he'd like to, before we open things up to the participants. And I will say that participants can now unmute their video and their audio. Just keep it quiet. But if you want to say something, Zach, please do. It's been a minute.
Yeah, no, this is intense. I mean, it's what's to say? Yeah, so the enclosure movement eventually began to include the enclosure of human nature. So this is to touch on Jordan's point, and actually on Gregg's point about the pathologies of modern psychology. And the notion here is basically that, my sanity and your sanity, our properly working nervous systems, our healthy bodies, this is part of the common thing we share together. And this is one of the things that has been partitioned and degraded and homogenized in a similar way to that the land and other aspects of the more obvious natural commons were enclosed. And this is a classic notion kind of from the critical theory of the Frankfurt School and the like, that the first commodity frontiers were physical. We controlled outside nature, and in the process of doing that, we began to have to control more and more of the internal nature. Habermas eventually talked about this as the colonization of the life world, and to the degree that the life world, which includes the dinner table especially, to the degree, and conversations, right, to the degree that the life world is colonized, then the sacred has been profaned, and we are stuck in a situation of a degraded state where it's hard to even bootstrap out of. Right, like eventually the soil gets so bad, it's like, what are you going to do here? You have to move somewhere else. And so that possibility of a more and I've talked about a catastrophic bifurcation of intergenerational transmission. This is what I'm talking about. It's a vector of civilizational collapse. And we're approaching it precisely because of this dynamic of misunderstanding of what is sacred with regards to the commons. It's not about the whales and the rainforest and stuff, although that's important, right? It's about your thoughts, right? And your imagination and your ability to have empathy, and a few other things which are being systematically, for some time now, I think, at an accelerating rate. And of course, the epistemic commons, right? Of not just your imagination and your thoughts, but the ideas we hold together that are a link between us about what is real, right? Hannah Arendt, right? The human condition, she uses the metaphor of us sitting around a table. And the table is real, and it both separates us and connects us, and it gives us a distance from one another, but it also gives us something to hold on to. And in the absence of the table, there's both nothing between us and a distance between us. And there's no shared object upon which we can place the matters of concern, right? There's no world to be worlded or cared about. And so this is the condition out of which we have to think about bootstrapping something like the wisdom commons, right? Yep. And so it's that sense that Jordan expressed the difficulty. And in fact, the way that as things emerge, you see this like the so-called psychedelic renaissance and Buddhism and other things. It's like as soon as it pops up, it's like whack-a-mole, but from the perspective of disintegrating the potency of ritual and these kinds of things. So there's something deep that has to be solved here. And I think it's actually probably first needs to be solved around the dinner table before we think about solving it in large congregations and groups of people and things of that nature. Which is to say that like often we'll go there to do drugs and have altered experiences to escape the difficulty of the sacred that's actually right in front of us around the dinner table. And so that's important to get, that it's like you can export the sacred to these places and the wisdom to these places that become. So let me roll back for 1 second, and then I'll be done. Which is that, right? The pre-modern made this distinction between the sacred and the profane, like hugely big, right? And that was kind of a problem, right? Because like sexual repression and like a whole bunch of stuff happened because of this rift, and the white suicide of the monasteries and other things, which made it so that if you were engaged with the sacred, you had to leave the world, basically. Modernity was like, that's one of the things that sucks that we're trying to overcome. Right? Like, and the modernity had this like the repotentiation of the everyday. That's why money became so important, and other things which would be profane became, in a sense, sacred, but the sacred disappeared. And so you had this vacuous, and eventually now postmodern, completely flat land, everything is profane. So to recapture the sacred means to draw the boundary between the sacred and the profane, but we have to do that in a way that is different from the way it was done in pre-modernity, and this is essential. And that's one of the things I don't think we've figured out quite how to do yet, because most of the attempts I've seen just create these new cloistered spaces, and they're either literally physically cloistered spaces, or they're forms of the central nervous system, which endogenously or exogenically induced, create a space which is different from the everyday ordinary space, right? And so that question of how to have the distinction and yet not fall into the traps of world denying, which came with the pre-modern distinction between the sacred. So that's one of the, let's just mention that, it's like this, as we're merging the wisdom commons, and the wisdom in the commons is synonymous basically with the sacred, then, how do we not create the devil in the process of creating the sacred, right? Like, how do we not create the scapegoat in the process of creating the chosen, right? And very difficult.
Yeah,
Almost
real difficult.
Hasn't been accomplished, right?
Yeah,
with the exception
it
of
hasn't been. And frankly, I haven't done this publicly, but I'm gonna do it now. Here's where I give, deep honor to my mentors, to Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison. And they were high modernists, literary modernists, not scientific modernists. So that's different. But anyway, one distinction that I have from Murray is that he maintains the secular sacred division. But when I look at the music, when I feel the music, when I hear the music, and I look at the history of the music itself, even though commodification puts it into particular genre categories, we know that, but I'm talking about the experience of the music itself among the musicians and the audience. The secular and the sacred is collapsed. So it happens in participatory knowledge, right? And perspectival, where we can look at it and talk about it, but it's not going to be propositional. Of course, I'm riffing on Johnny V, on John Vervaeke. It's got to be participatory, a shared space where those dichotomies and polarities and binaries are collapsed, where the thesis and antithesis goes into a synthesis. Of course, Daniel loves that. I've seen him, talk about it. Of course, we're talking about that comes from Western philosophy, I know. And I know Bonita has done some wonderful variations on that. Yes, I'm aware of your work, Bonita. But I think we're going to have to decouple some things, and we're going to have to allow certain things to be collapsed. And the small scales, I agree with that, Zach. It's got to be on the small scales. My relationship here with my wife, we have a commons. We are growing, we're individuals, but we are growing together, and we go through our stuff together, and we are developing and growing together. We're in a neighborhood here. We're in Stratford, Connecticut, in Fairfield County. When it snowed here, we have neighbors across the street who we didn't have a snowblower. They came over unbidden and unasked, and used their snowblower to help us out. We said, oh God, we've got to get a snowblower. He says, what are you talking about? It's going to be the highest prices. Wait till the spring, buy it then, you'll use mine. The next snowstorm, the neighbors across the street from the garage, they said, wait a second, now you're not going to one-up me. He came over before the other one did to help. I mean, that's a commons. That's the kind of fundamental, basic human neighborliness. That's a foundation. So yes, we could think of it in a large macro scale, but it's got to happen definitely in the micro. Okay. So
Yeah.
I want to throw Gregg something, can I?
yeah, man.
Yeah, because when you were saying that, I was like, well, I get the sense, the very distinct sense that you can go one level smaller and maybe two levels if you go down, right? We got this weird thing. Maybe the origin story of the whole problem was that we developed this prefrontal cortex, but we haven't come into relationship with it. And it's a part, right? It's a part of the brain, but it's a part that takes responsibility for, has connection with, has perception with, and actuation with the whole. Right? So it's one of these whole part relationships. But the point is that as we have noticed, as we have discovered, it can take over the whole, right? It can take itself, has a tyrannical relationship with our own interior. Now, you can talk about it psychologically, monkey mind, ego mind, things like that. You can talk about it neuroanatomically, like I just was. But that notion of wholesomeness and learning how to deal with the emergent commons of yourself, I think is actually T0. It's only as you build skillfulness of actually coming with a wholeness back out into the world and a maturity that comes from having gone through the process of individuation and then self, that I think you can even begin to really durably, not just every once in a while, but durably show up in relationship with others. And then that spiral gets bigger and bigger. Double G.
Yeah. So for me, one of the things as you were speaking, there's a book by Rutger Bregman called Humankind. One of the things that it speaks to is the power of our prosociality. And I really do think that we can talk a lot about game A, which of course, the way in which civilization morphed created a competitive dynamic inside of us and allowed for a particular manifestation of that, which we obviously want to recognize. But inside of us also is a deep and profound prosociality. Okay. And I believe inside deep of us, there is a very, very powerful need for mutual relational value. So one of the things that I see in terms of this whole emergent commons is how can we capture the intuitive note to cultivate that sense and create a boundary that protects it, but at the same time acknowledges it and nurtures it developmentally across horizontal relations and across intergenerational relations.
That's probably the next step. Yeah. Starting with what Jordan said, it's got, go back to ancient Kemet or Egypt. It showed up in Greece, know thyself. One of the things that one of the people I really look to, Dwayne Elgin, who from 1978 was predicting that by the 2020s, we as a human family are either going to have a breakthrough or breakdown. And one of the things that he talks about, I mean, lose my thought here. I lost it. Shucks.
Breakdown.
Well, there was the individual and the group. Damn it, I lost it. Maybe I'm supposed to lose it because, and there's so much to share and we have so little time.
Right, it's 6:46.
Oh my goodness. And I always, with these situations, I always feel it incumbent as a moderator to get in, folks from the participants, the audience. So maybe it's good that I didn't remember so we can bring some more folks in. Peter, can you field some questions?
Sounds good.
Comments if people want to, just come in.
Right. So start putting your questions in chats in the chat. I just want to present we have 15 minutes to the top of the hour. So we'll squeeze at least one in. Is that?
Well, one of the things I want to do, because every single time I do want to acknowledge Chris D, always come up with great questions, but it ends up being with Evan McMullen. At the end, he asks like a great question and we don't have time. So you may not have a question, Evan, but I want to give you first shot. I want to give you first shot, man.
Yeah, he definitely has a question.
Evan. Or comment, statement, Evan McMullen. Come on in, man.
All right, appreciate it. Yeah, I do have questions, and I've loved the music you guys have been playing with your voices so far today. So my question is kind of long, but bear with me. So it seems to me that the history of humanity so far is the history of the desacralization of nature, the decommoning of the world in large. And so if we're running with this notion of the commons as being related to or some sense identical with the sacred, then it seems that we need to develop what I would call the metis, the Greek word here, the skill, the craft of required to defend these little small bubbles where we have a sense of the sacred and a sense of the commons from infection by the forces of what Scott Alexander calls Moloch, right? Which in his essay, he sort of defines as, among other things, the furnace into which you burn the sacred for temporary advantage in zero-sum games. So this sort of metis cultivation seems to have been de-emphasized in the sort of wisdom traditions that we have access to in the form that we have access to them. And so it seems that this cultivation specifically is what needs to be rebirthed because the other aspects of the wisdom traditions are still present with us and available to us. So my question for the panel is, one, do you agree or disagree with this analysis? And two, if you do agree with it, then how would you suggest individually or as a panel that we, the participants, can cultivate this sort of defensive metis in our own lives, families, and organizations?
Very quickly, very quickly. Were you going to say something, Zach? Or
okay, I was potentially, but go ahead.
Okay,
yeah, I was pointing to Jamie because he had unmuted.
What'd you say? Oh yeah, you were muted. But I just let me say it really quickly. Bless you. What do you value? What do you care about? What's important to you? Is there anything you revere? Do you have reverence for anything? If you have reverence for something, if you have deep feeling for something, why? What is it? What does that represent? What do others have deep feeling and reverence for? Values. If we can take a look at the shared and distinct values, right? And find ways to acknowledge and respect the values and development of people where they are, while we hold on to our own and get beyond just tolerating, but to actually interact, kind of in a Nora Bateson, a warm data sense, that's part of what it's going to take. But we have to identify what the heck do we value? What do we revere? Reverence has to come back into online, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Martin Prechtel, he's a Mayan elder. He has a beautiful expression. He says, feed the holy. You know, that idea, and this is his resolution to original sin, right? He's like, rather than us feeling like we're trespassers here or that we are part of the wrongness, understand that we are forever consuming. We chop down trees for firewood. We kill animals for food. We make a dent. That's unavoidable. So feed the holy, like give back. And I think I saw in the chat somewhere, it's now, we've scrolled past it, but someone was maybe, I think rightly, gently calling into question this notion of climax philosophy. You know, that if we get to a wonderful, emergent, coherent state, then everything will be saved. You know, and that concept is the same in ecology, right? We like to think of old growth redwoods as good and steady state and forever, and they're not, right? They're just one more phase, and they get blown down and burned down, and up come meadows and aspens. You know, like it is forever change, and that we can be snookered into fascism, even subtle crypto-fascism, by hanging our hats on a salvatory climax or a dualistic opposition. So even in the defending of the commons, there has to be an other, there has to be a wrongness against which we defend. And and all the Zen traditions, blah, 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 right? The moment you've created the split, you've sown the seeds for additional suffering. And so my sense is like, Bhagavad Gita style, we're fucked. 7 ways to Sunday. Any way you pencil it out, it doesn't, right? And yet, right, where does our redemption lie? Like seek refuge in the feeding of the holy. And it's sort of as if, it's almost as if, look, hey, I'm damned if I do, and I'm damned if I don't. And the best laid plans of mice and men end badly, right? But the one thing I can be in charge of is, if we think of it like, playing a game of pool, and racking the balls, right? Like you try and do it. You don't know how the game's going to go. But the one thing we have control over is the vigor of our break. Like me actually trying to influence matter. Now, what happens is going to be orthogonal as fuck to my intention. My intention was linear. My hope is victory, right? What happens with the pool balls ricocheting around, bouncing off each other, some going where I hope, some bouncing off each other, some lucky breaks, right? That part is out of our hands. But the vigor of our break, like that's the Gita bit, right? Like playing our part to the fullest is the one and only thing we can do. And then leave space for grace.
Leave space for grace.
I got something to throw in, Greg.
Go for it, man.
Grieve. Grieve. If you are anything like me, your soul has been crucified every minute of every day for the greater part of your entire life. You have reverence. Can't help it, man. You got reverence. But you cannot suffer the crucifixion of your reverence in the world that you've grown up in. And so you hide from it. You hold back. You harden. And thereby become the one that crucifies your brother's reverence. So you got to grieve. I mean, you should get on. If you really are living life right now, honestly, you should be on your knees, racked with grief every night. And then you get back up and you come back into the world. That's how you cultivate metis.
That's the transition in Murray from blues as such, suffering, melancholy, depression, to blues music, which is a counter statement to the blues. So you feel into it fully, and then you keep on going and trying to do the best that you can, as skillfully as you can. As skillfully, as you said in your last session, Jordan, I evoked John V's serious play, and then I think you said serious fucking play. Anybody else want to respond to that?
I'll answer Evan's question, which is I do agree with your framing. I think that it is the case that we've been given traditions and haven't been told how to protect them. And it's not just from commodification, it is also from, depends how weird you want to get with your ontology, but most of the traditions came with means for protecting oneself, not just against worldly enemies. And this is part of what the problem is with a lot of the things, including psychedelic renaissance and elsewhere, where you're looking at dynamics, depends on, again, we'll go to Blavatsky, since I mentioned her already, right? So the astral plane is a dangerous place to go if you have not been taught how to protect yourself. And the internet, with its endless array of images and its limbic capture and other things, approximates almost more than anything we've ever created something like astral immersion without disembodied consciousness. So this question of how we actually protect ourselves is a very, very good question, Evan. And the degree to which the efforts begin to look sacred is the degree to which this effort, and the blues is an example of metis. That's what I want to mention to weave Jordan's point. And Gregg, that's the point that they're making, is that the blues is an example of what African Americans did to protect themselves as sacred beings. And Sun Ra is maybe the greatest example of this, because he was explicitly doing that with mysticism and magic and word sound power. So there's a sense of, urgency to the protection. And again, that begins with the dinner table too, right? Protect the space between you, which means put the phone away and sit there and look at one another, right? So, yeah. But it's a great question. It's important to be thinking about, especially as more of these things begin to grow. There used to be means for protecting the sacred space always.
Can I just build on that, just because Zach, one lap prior where you shared that beautiful metaphor of the table, right? Whose was that, by the way? It was
Hannah Arendt.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Yeah, the human condition.
Yeah. And just before you had said that, I was feeling like we were getting really heady about the notions of kind of like abstract emergence. And what I wanted to say then was, hey, rocking chair front porch wisdom, like start with the folks next to us, like be kind to each other, right? And then you kind of built on that. And because you hit that note, then that note had already been played. So I'm like, well, wait, what about the opposite? And because the opposite, I mean, you've got the Gandhi thing of, if you do not see God in the eyes of the next person you meet, look no further, right? And we could say the same about communitas, right? Or some deep intersubjective connection. But, like life's a bitch. It's fucking heavy and hard and dense, and being householders together and, and making our way through this life. It's very hard to just flip that switch and go, hey, I just was looking on the wrong side of things. So our connection, our periodic, ritualized, enculturated connection to the sacred is essential for us to be able to practice the work at home. Like Dorothy couldn't have just kicked it in Kansas and had her epiphany, right? And so the notion of momentary, ritualized, sacramental access to Kairos functions, and playing with the chronological of it all is, functions as metronome tuning fork and training wheels for coherent emergence together, right? Like, am I on the pulse of life or not, right? Is my instrument in tune or not? And Zach, you've referenced the psychedelic renaissance, kind of excessive Kanchi culture, et cetera, et cetera. I think those examples are really good, because it's like, well, how does a musician use a metronome and a tuning fork? They use it to prepare to play with others. They don't fucking fiddle with the metronome and the tuning fork for days upon days upon days. They're like, I'm on time, I'm in tune, now let's go jam. And it's that much easier for us to find, listening for the secret, searching for the sound, right? It's a lot easier to find the groove together when those two things are true. And we attain that by ritualized access, periodic, to Kairos.
Mm-hmm. In music, the band, before it plays, there's an A that's played. So what is the note that we're going to play, that we're going to all tune to before we go into our various roles and da-da-da-da? There's got to be a note that we tune to. Maybe it's the sacred, I don't know. But it seems to be a lot of people plus wanting something that Bonita said. So Peter, I mean, if the guests have a little more time, we should presence it. I think we should go ahead and let her either speak or Peter read it. I don't know.
Benita, would you like to unmute yourself and make your statement?
Yeah, I just think that this notion of how did he say it? I can make it sure. We are householders together, and like it's a great definition of the commons. We are householders of the earth. We are householders of them something. I mean, I don't know, Jamie, if you had that phrase in your head or it just emerged, but it's like fantastically beautiful. And yeah, I think that's very generative. And how do we household together? And I'm thinking of Wendell Berry, because the root of the word economy is echo. Echo means homemaking, householding and homemaking. So like a lot of these really creative dialogues happen where you get the real starting point at the end. And to me, this is a starting point. But I used to like hang out with Sun Ra and like all these like studio jazz people in New York.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, in the early 80s. I wrote something. I wanted you to riff off of that. And like you'd walk in and they'd be like these jazz phenoms that you knew. And there'd be like these African women, these black women, and they'd have these pots of soup, and you'd walk in, things didn't start till like 2:00 in the morning, and you'd walk in and they'd offer you this soup, and everything was like very community oriented. And then you'd go and see Sun Ra play, and you'd be sitting on the floor, and they'd be right there and stuff. And there was like this secret, like Sun Ra doesn't have words like rap people. Like the words are meaningless. And there was this thing that would happen, and yeah, I don't know. Huh?
Very, very interesting. I haven't commented on Sun Ra, but allow me to. One, the gentleman who wrote the book on Sun Ra, John Sved.
Yeah, amazing book.
Yeah, was a professor of mine at NYU, and I was a member of the jazz studies group there at Columbia while I was in grad school at NYU, and it became the Center for Jazz Studies. And John Sved is still at Columbia. He's like a academic mystic. I'll just put that out there. But Sun Ra, what I love about him is, yes, the cosmic is there, but he also stayed with the blues. He also played Fletcher Henderson, Charlie. So as we go to the cosmic, there's got to be some rooted there. We need both at the same freaking time. It's not just about being abstract. You got to be in the earth too, man. You got to dig in there. So yeah, he's a real good example.
Yeah, but I don't center around Sun Ra. My favorite beats, it's like my favorite jazz is circus jazz.
Circus jazz?
Yeah.
What's that?
Henry Threadgill out of the Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a much more complex and sophisticated form of jazz, Henry Threadgill. And so I do a workshop on how learning to listen to that circus jazz actually is the same pathway for Vipassana meditation.
Ooh, that's interesting.
It actually is. So anyways, I don't know, I told Peter, don't call me in. It's late at night, and here I am. And yeah, I love the conversation, and just trying to lighten up. Jamie, your statement on householding, yeah, it hooked me, and I got caught in your net, and yeah, loving it. So that's all I got. I'm gonna go bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Well, two quick things that come from me. One is, metaphors. I mean, you talk about story and narratives. That's one thing, but metaphors. I think we're going to have to take metaphors with us, new metaphors for this new emerging wisdom commons that we desire. And Threadgill is part of the AACM lineage, Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. That's a whole nother. Jazz is such a deep form that has these various offshoots. So thank you for presencing that. But I think now, wow, Oh man, Gregg, my partner, I want to give you a chance to make some, any closing remarks you'd like to make before we pass it to our guests, because it's been a minute since you've spoken.
Absolutely. Yeah. First off, I just want to thank the contributions, the presence of this space. It feels to me like we have at least done something to enact what it is that we came to talk about. And I feel when I do a gut check, when I feel wisdom energy, I basically just do a resonant gut check of my heart and body. And it feels there's a warmth and a centering that emerges at that place. And so I guess what I would say is, there's the abstract thing and then the whole fractal pattern. And I think we captured a bit of the fractal pattern here, and I appreciate everybody's contributions around that.
Thank you. Who would like to say some final words? Zach, Jamie, Jordan.
It was fun. It's always good to talk to these guys and both the Greggs, and talk about jazz is a rare trip. So yeah, there's many stories I will resist telling right now because we're supposed to wrap, but there are many jazz related stories from my past. So
we'll get there, man. We
man.
On another occasion for sure. Thank you. Jamie, who was the first person to put the music, the wisdom tradition that comes from the music. He's the first person who laid it out for us. So
yeah, he did.
Yeah, what would you like to share, Jamie?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, is it okay if I read something short? This is in response to Jordan, because Jordan, you spoke such powerful heart-based stuff on the whole notion of daily crucifixion, right? And this is from the conclusion. So this is talking about soul force. The possibility grows for moving goodness forward in the world. There's a term for this contagion of courage. It's called soul force. Martin Luther King wove it into his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. Again and again, he said, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. But those weren't King's words or ideas. He had borrowed them twice over. One of his spiritual mentors was Howard Thurman, who in 1935 traveled to India as the first African-American interfaith ambassador. There he met with Mahatma Gandhi and became steeped in the peaceful resistance the Indian lawyer called satyagraha. On Thurman's return to the United States, he translated the Sanskrit term into something more accessible, soul force, and began sharing its power with Black ministers and activists. Until Thurman, nonviolent protest was a tactic of the civil rights movement more than a central philosophy. It was a calculated move not to provoke the Bull Connors of the world. After Thurman shared Gandhi's message and King embraced it, soul force became the foundational strategy of social justice movements everywhere. But Thurman was more a mystic than an activist. In one of those grace notes of history, he also delivered the sermon at the famous 1962 Good Friday experiment at Harvard Divinity School. Most accounts of that service focus on the headlines. Seminarians were given the psychedelic psilocybin, and many of them had profound mystical experiences that day. But virtually nowhere can you find accounts of what they were thinking about, sitting in Marsh Chapel, watching the sunlight stream through its rose-petaled, stained glass windows. Everyone's familiar with the musical cadence of the Baptist preacher tradition. Martin Luther King epitomized it. Barack Obama rode its rhythms into the White House. Thurman sounded nothing like that. His voice was a rumbling baritone. His cadence was irregular and marked with as much silence as sound. In the closing minutes of an hour-long Good Friday sermon, in a chapel of tripping mystics, he told the story of hearing an anguished voice crying out, "Forgiveness." I went out and searched and found a man in the throes of crucifixion. I said, "I will take you down." I tried to take the nails out of his feet, but he said, "Let them be, for I cannot be taken down until every man and every woman and every child will come together to take me down." I said, "But I cannot stand to hear you cry. What can I do?" He said, "Go about the world. Tell everyone you meet that there's a man on the cross. A man on the cross. Tell everybody that you meet. That man on the cross is Anthropos. That cross lies at the intersection of Kairos and Chronos. A couple of thousand years ago, his realization was rare and remarkable. Today, it's required of all of us. It's this recognition of our divinity and our mortality that delivers us to our full humanity. Every man, woman, and child, every homegrown human. Take out the nails, remove the thorns, forgive ourselves and each other, not to usher in the second coming, but to bring about the umpteenth coming. It's time to take him down. It's time for us to step up. Tell everyone you meet.
Hmm. Jordan.
Well, I get the feeling the right thing to do now is to invoke Brother John Cage. We should spend 1 minute of silence.
4:33. Let that linger in the air. Thank you so much, Jamie, Jordan, Zach, Gregg Double G, Peter Limberg, the steward. Thank all of you who have been here with us in this session, in other sessions. Thank those of you who may be watching this in the video. We thank you also. We're just grateful for the opportunity to share and deal with these such important ideas that have to do with how we as human beings are going to continue, survive, and hopefully thrive. And so may the spirit of our intention infuse this series and all of you. It's a prayer. I'm actually doing a prayer. I want to ask that each of you be blessed. And as we're in this liminal period, and may we come out of it, and may we use some of the juice and wisdom that's been shared here and through other sessions at the store to do it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Greg.
Yes, of course. Thank everybody.
Thanks for the guests and thanks for everybody. Peter, you rock. Thank you.